Hey, philosophy students. Hope you're doing well. I'm looking forward to our final unit, and it's our next unit and our final unit, and it's about ethics. To me, when I was a philosophy student, when I took courses at the graduate level or undergrad level, it was really ethics that I think interested me the most because there's a direct application to our lives, and I think it'll be the same for you. I just wish we had more time to kind of talk about ethics and have you engage in it a little bit together in class. But the good news is, I think that I've figured out a real good way to kind of introduce you to the major ethical theories by presenting some ethical scenarios or dilemmas to you, and then having you think about those dilemmas, and then applying each of the schools of thought to that dilemma to see what they would say. You know, the classic: there's a child tied up on a rail on a train track, and do you run over the child to save the 500 people on board the train, or do you divert the train away from the child? You've probably heard some variations of those over the years, but what I'll do as we go forward is we'll use the different ethical theories to inform you in terms of how they would answer that dilemma. And then you can look at the different theories and say, which one do I agree with the most? Which one makes the most sense in my reasoning? And so I'm looking forward to that because I think it's a unique way to do it, and I'm excited about it. I always read new philosophy every year, so part of the thing that helps keep me fresh is to read new things, and I think this is a unique approach to it. So I'm going to share that with you, and I think it'll help you to make sense of these things rather than just look at some dry theories and kind of figure out what this philosopher was talking about. So I'm excited. Oh, I hope you are as well. What I want to do tonight, I'm recording this at night. You'll be watching it perhaps in the morning, but one of the things I want to do is just give you a basic introduction to ethics. I'm sure you've probably heard that word before. Ethical. Try to live an ethical life. You could probably figure out what that means if someone were to say that to you. But I want to just define it as far as a branch of philosophy. Okay, so in the beginning of our course, we looked at the major branches of philosophy: metaphysics, what is real, okay, the study of reality; epistemology, which we just got done with, is the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? What is certainty? We have ethics, which I think we can define it as the study of values and moral principles and how they relate to our conduct and social institutions. I'm going to say that again for you, okay? It's the study of values and moral principles and how they relate to our conduct and social institutions. So with ethics and values, you notice those terms are kind of used interchangeably. There's an individual part of ethics, and then there's how do we apply it to groups, to our institutions, like the family, the school, the institution of marriage, right? There's a lot of different institutions in society that have ethical concerns as well. So it deals with questions like what is right, what is wrong, and how about this? What or who determines whether an action is right or wrong? Many people argue today the individual does that. I determine what's right and what's wrong. It's all up to me. Now, that sounds good when we say it and when we practice that and when we hear it. But one of the things I think you'll find as we go through this is people are not consistent with that. That is a form of ethical relativism, and we'll talk about that. So that's one of the things that people will say. The other thing, there are other things that can determine for us what is right or what is wrong. For instance, tradition. We've all been raised in a certain tradition. Some of us have some weird things that have kind of been passed down to us as we go, as far as right and wrong. And so maybe it's tradition that informs why we do what we do. Maybe it's cultural norms. What we consider right or wrong here might not be considered right and wrong somewhere else. a classic example. This might not be the best example, but it shows you how this can happen. Um, when a large influx of Asian American students came into California on the West Coast, they were having trouble communicating with their teachers because the teachers would talk to them and the students would look down. And so the teachers would traditionally say to them, or typically say to them, look at me when I'm talking to you. And they viewed it as a sign of disrespect. When in many Asian cultures, to look an adult in the eye is considered disrespectful and wrong. It's a lack of respect for the adult. So there you go, right there. Cultural norms were a difference maker in terms of right and wrong ethical codes there as interactions were happening. The relativism says it's an individual choice. Some religious people would say that God tells them what's right and what's wrong. That is the foundation of their moral choices. And some even argue it's genetics. Your genes inform you what's right and what's wrong. So there's, you know, think of the different varieties of answers to when people say, what's the foundation of your ethics? What's the foundations of your morality? Those are just a few different answers that people can give. It is any wonder why we have trouble understanding and communicating with each other, let alone making and passing laws, setting policies in institutions, communicating in a marriage or a family. You know, so large differences. Okay. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to share my screen with you for a second because I uploaded some your assignment, which is questions 1 through 6, but it's a means to introduce this unit on ethics. So let me just do this. Let me share my screen. And here we go. Let's go. Let's see. Here. Okay. Now here's it. Here is a list of behaviors: stealing, speeding, having sex, telling a lie, cheating on a test, getting drunk, abortion, euthanasia, and pornography. Quite a list of behaviors to varying degrees of what we would call serious moral decision making. You know, we could go through each one of these and, you know, talk about how important it can be, how dangerous it would be to engage in some of these things. And then, you know, what informs us at each one of these areas, whether something is right or wrong. Is it ever right or wrong to steal, to speed, to cheat on a test, you know, getting drunk, abortion, euthanasia, pornography? A lot of these issues deeply divide our nation. And people oftentimes argue past one another because they're actually starting from a different moral foundation than somebody else's. And they never really take the time to look at it. So it's a reoccurring theme in this philosophy course that we've been studying since the beginning. Socrates would say, look at the foundation and you'll come to a much easier and better understanding of one another. And so that's where he would always go back to, which is why he used the Socratic method to question people, to get them back to what their foundation is. And it's really even more important in some ways to do this in ethics, as you can see the implications of these behaviors and whether we engage in them or not. So the first, these are just 3 examples of what people can base their ethics on. I'm going to give you more than these, but we'll start on this assignment with just these 3. I'm going to add a little bit to what you see here that the textbook individuals kind of thought was important. They did a good job with this, but I think I would add a little bit more to help you to understand it. First of all, one of the most basic arguments that was made in the ancient world for what we base our ethics on is something called natural law. Now, this is the idea that there is a natural law that applies to ethics. Okay, just like there's a law of gravity, there's a natural law that tells us what's right and what's wrong. And I'm just going to stop for a second. As I go through these, this is just what the ethical theory says. You don't have to agree with it. You can disagree with it. You can think it's garbage. You can think it's the best thing you've ever heard. I'm just going to describe to you what the theory teaches. Okay, so our good friends Plato and Aristotle would fall into this category. And this and other philosophers would be Thomas Aquinas and Augustine believed in natural law, okay, as far as ethics go. What this argues is that something is right if it fulfills its true purposes, wrong if it goes against these purposes. So as humans, these guys believed that we were designed for a specific purpose. And if we do something that fulfills our purpose as a human, then it's right. If we don't do that, if we do something that goes against what our true purposes are, it's wrong. Okay? So there's a couple of examples they give you here with sex. It's okay if it's done for procreation because that's its purpose. It's not okay if it's done for recreation. That would be an example. Okay? So natural law would kind of dictate that. And then something like abortion, which is pretty controversial. The natural law ethical individuals would say that it's wrong because it is natural for all creatures to seek and preserve life. So if you want to get even simpler than that, murder and stealing and some of those other things, you could argue from a natural law perspective is wrong, okay? Now, what's interesting about this is Aquinas and Augustine were clearly religious figures, religious philosophers. Plato and Aristotle, not so much, okay? Not in a way we would understand anyways. So Aristotle, if you remember, talked about the unmoved mover, but he was not what we would characterize as a religious figure in certainly a Western context. And neither was Plato. You know, Plato talked about the forms as being out there and things like that. And they didn't really hold these views on these things. This is just an example. But natural law, just like the law of gravity, you know what's right and what's wrong because it's natural. It comes natural to you. Nobody has to teach you these things. So Aquinas argued, if you want to get real simple with this, one of the natural laws is that good is to be pursued and evil is to be avoided. That's pretty simple. That's a simple natural law that everybody knows. Okay, he argued some other things too, like to preserve life, to educate your offspring, to gain understanding, to live in society, and to avoid offending others. Okay, so those were some things that he characterized as kind of natural law. They're common sense. They come natural to you, and that's how you determine what's right and what's wrong. What I'm going to do as we go is I'm going to go more in depth with some of these and give you the pros and the strengths and the weaknesses of these theories. Okay, so that's natural law. That's one basis of ethics. The next one is utilitarianism. And I don't know if you've heard this word before, but it's very, very popular, very famous in the ethical world. And what this teaches is it's the right thing to do. So something is either right or wrong. It's right if the action provides the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. Greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, okay? Now, Jeremy Bentham came up with the theory originally. A friend of his was the father of John Stuart Mill, who's more famous, actually, because of the work that he did with this theory. But Jeremy Bentham actually came up with the first real utilitarian philosophical theory. I don't know if you guys remember, I think this is going back now. You might have been, you were young boys and girls when this show was on, but the show Lost used their character names were actually philosophers, many of them. So Jeremy Bentham, for instance, was a character. Locke was another one. And so I would say probably 90% of Americans weren't aware of that. And just geeks like me knew what they were doing. But utilitarianism, the right thing to do is the action that provides the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. What they did, though, was they started with the individual, and they said, well, how much pain and pleasure is this going to bring you? If the pleasure outweighs the pain, then it's the right thing to do. If you extend this out to society, that's how you make decisions as well. Now, Bentham had a pretty intricate system. It was actually a calculus, a formula that he would follow, and I'll share that with you when we get more in depth with these. But he basically, you do it like a mathematical theory, and you add it up, and if it comes out, the way that it should, then you know what the right thing to do is. John Stuart Mill talked, so Bentham was more about quantitative happiness. Some people call his theory quantitative hedonism. We'll get into that, but Stuart Mill talked about qualitative hedonism, that the idea of happiness and pleasure, there's a quality to it as opposed to a quantity. So John Stuart Mill is going to be famous because he's going to argue that it is better to be Socrates than a satisfied pig. Okay, so Socrates, we know, was executed, or he committed suicide because he thought it was more important to pursue truth, to engage in philosophy, and to understand his world. Because of that, he was given a death sentence by the jury in Athens. So what Stuart Mill is arguing, there is a greater degree of pleasure in the intellectual and philosophical pursuits than there are in the bodily pleasure that you may experience. So Plato might argue that most, like going back to the cave, most of us are like that pig rolling around in the mud. We'd rather do that. It's a lower form of existence. As long as we stimulate our nerve endings and we kind of engage in physical pleasure, we're okay. Well, John Stuart Mill said, people who engage in intellectual pleasures, that is at a higher quality of pleasure than the physical bodily types of pleasure. So he would get into his utilitarianism and say, well, let's talk about the quality of the happiness as opposed to just the quantity of it. Again, we'll get into more of that, but a real simple explanation here is, what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people? What is going to bring the most happiness to the greatest number of people? Think about what is happening right now with with COVID-19 and figuring out what to do as far as public policy goes. You don't need to be an expert in philosophy to know that this is right at the heart of what people are trying to decide. Do we open the beaches in New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York? Do we open schools? Do we not open schools? What is the balance here, right? And many people are using, and many policymakers are using a utilitarian approach to figure this thing out. And they may not even be aware that they are, okay? And that, of course, lends itself in a democracy pretty well. But we'll talk about, there's some cons with this too that we have to be careful of. And so we'll talk about that as well. But that is another thing, another basis that you can kind of make ethical decisions based upon, is this utilitarian idea. Then we have our friend Immanuel Kant. Now, remember I told you of what a big difference he made in terms of synthesizing rationalists and empiricists. Well, he makes a big difference here too in something he calls the categorical imperative. And so he also argues that universal moral laws exist, laws which determine the rightness and wrongness of actions, which are based upon the golden rule. Okay, so there's universal moral laws that tell us what's right and what's wrong. And the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is that this is kind of what they're based on. All right, so I'm going to say it to you this way. Immanuel Kant argues, and there's a lot more to this theory. I'm going to make it as simple as I can, just for our purposes for your introductory lesson. But if you're trying to figure out whether it's right or wrong to do something, he would ask you this question. Could you will for everybody in the universe to do the same thing you're about to do every time they're confronted with this situation? If you were to say, whoa, probably not, then Kant would say you have your answer. You shouldn't do it. Should I cheat on this test? Should everybody cheat on a test when they come to a difficult problem? Would you will that our entire society cheated on every test they had when they came to a difficult problem? Well, I think that kind of, for many of us, we would answer no. And so Kant would say, then very clearly, it's wrong for you to do the same thing. So the examples they give you here, murder is wrong. Would you will that everybody would murder somebody else when they were frustrated in a situation or lost their temper or something like that, okay? So Kant would say that there are categorical imperatives irregardless of the consequences, all right? So Mill and Bentham with utilitarianism are looking at the consequences of your action. Kant says you don't need to do that. You need to look at the action itself and determine categorically, could you make this the standard for everybody? If your answer is no, then you know it's the wrong thing to do. So kind of a neat, just these three theories, right, are much different from one another. And will come out with perhaps much different answers to solutions and problems if you use these as your foundation. Okay. Now, this introductory little essay here is What is Ethics? It's Terry Carpenter. So you're just going to read it, okay? And you can read what it tells. It talks about, as you see there, it talks about cultural relativist. It gives you a little bit, of that idea as well, along with what we just talked about. And they basically ask you 6 questions, okay? List the different fields of ethics. What's the difference between rules and principles, okay? What is a cultural relativist in ethics? In your own words, define the theory of utilitarianism. And what were the different responses to the question of what is the good life? What is the difference between an ethicist, one who studies ethics, and the ordinary person concerned about making moral decisions? So those are your 6 questions. Do your best and fill those answers in. You can scan those back to me, whatever's easier for you as far as handing them in. You have until Friday, okay? I'm going to give you another assignment during the week. So you'll have your 2 written assignments that'll be due on Friday. And then I may actually give you another video too that I'll have you watch explaining your final assessment. So there you go. Some fun stuff. At least to me it is. I hope it is to you too. We can, talk about these things as we go. If anything is unclear, please email me, ask me. I'm happy to help you. And because this may come natural to some of us, and to some of us like, what are you talking about? Philosophy has a tendency to be like that. But going back to what we talked about in the beginning of the course, remember that you are all philosophers. You all do this every day. Okay, you are operating right now as you watch this video on a philosophical foundation. And the reason I started the course with that article, Philosophy Who Needs It, is because it's a constant reminder of why you do need it. All of you are doing philosophy on May 15th, okay, or 16th or 17th or 18th, whatever date you're in. You are doing philosophy in the very moment that you're watching this. The question is, are you aware of what's informing your decisions? Are you aware of the foundation that you're operating off of? And if the answer is no, then you're not in control really of your actions. You may be operating on a philosophical foundation that when you actually look at it, you say, I don't think I agree with that. And it might explain to you why you make some of the decisions that you do that get us in trouble, right? Maybe we make some bad decisions and we don't know why. Maybe we react a certain way to things and we don't know why either, right? So philosophy allows you to look at those underlying assumptions that we have and ask us, are we satisfied with those? Do we have good reasons to hold those things? And so it really liberates and frees you to make good decisions, or at least to be informed in terms of why you are making the decisions that you're making, okay? Just, let me just do the stop share. Just a little bit of something to think about tonight. Or this morning, again, whenever you're watching this, in terms of philosophy, okay? I'm looking forward to the unit. I hope you're all doing well. The weather's getting nice. It's healthy to be outside as long as you're socially distanced and, paying attention to all those other parameters that are important. But I'm thinking about you. I miss you tremendously. I really wish we could do this in person. But anyways, keep the faith, and I will talk to you soon. And again, let me know if you need anything. Just drop me an email. Okay? Take care.